So welcome back, everyone. We're going to get started with the next element, the next session from Lucie Matthews-Jones, who's going to be talking to us about creativity. Lucie is a reader in Victorian history at Liverpool John Moores University, and like Michael, is a Royal Historical Society award-winning teacher. She won an award last year for inspirational teaching and supervision in history. Yeah, so we're really looking forward to what she's got to say about creativity, and I know she's currently doing a bigger project around creativity and history teaching, so I think she'd really welcome your thoughts as well. So great.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about creativity, and I think it really responds to some of the points that Michael's already made in his presentation. But also I think it's a really nifty way of perhaps doing sort of thinking through and thinking about your module design more broadly. So I must admit, this morning I decided to Google historians into Google Images, and I was a little struck by how kind of dry, perhaps uninspiring this kind of looks, with the idea of it kind of being quite white male, but also the idea that there's a sense in which it's about thought and about processes, a little bit about primary sources, but also the fact that it feels overwhelmingly quite individual as how we approach it in our archives. For myself, I really believe in creativity. If any of you follow me on Twitter, then one of the things you'll know is that I do a lot of creative work, both in the seminar and also in my assessments. So I'm quite well known, and one of the reasons I won the Royal Historical Society Award was for my creative assessment, where students at the end of their third year module get to design and think about how they can communicate history beyond the written word in terms of the essay and in terms of other types of academic writing. And I think, really, to be honest with you, one of the reasons I've done this was I was being slightly pragmatic. I was having to mark an awful lot, and in the time in which I had to do it, I thought it might be nice to actually break away from marking, because I'm marking kind of words because I'm a neurodivergent academic, and it was just starting to feel very overwhelming. But also because, as we'll go through, I really do believe that actually one of the things we should be thinking about is how we make our learning practices very dynamic. And I just want to preface, because I think Michael raises a really interesting point about who is our student. And I think we really need to be very careful at not trying to make the student mini academics, not necessarily thinking that the end product is us who's going to go off and do a PhD or become university lecturers, because overwhelmingly that isn't students' aspirations, but it isn't also the skills that need to be developed for them to be able to kind of participate, you know, either like economically or socially or culturally in the world. I think we also need to be reminded that we are still in a pandemic learning environment, where a lot of our students have perhaps had disrupted learning experiences, where some of the skills that we actually think they have, they won't be coming in with as strongly as they perhaps we thought they would be. But we also had this we have this assumption that students come in with skills that they've made at school, but school isn't about creating history skills for university. They're skills very much developed for the context in which they're working in. So for me, one of the things I'd like us to think about, and I might just use the chat function, seeing as you've all been using it really well, is what do you think about when you hear the word creativity? Do you have any kind of feelings about this? What do you think makes creativity attractive? But also, what do you think the challenges are? And you're more than welcome to kind of put numbers next door to your responses and your replies. I've also put the Google document into the chat function, which you can also use if you want to. So I'll give you just a couple of minutes to do this. And obviously, don't feel like you need to reply to all of them, because that's quite a big selection of questions. Oh, thank you so much. I'm really enjoying everyone's responses. And I'm really loving this idea that everyone is sort of talking about this idea of it feeling like it's new, it's innovative, it's perhaps an original way of thinking about the past, and perhaps sort of thinking about kind of sort of playfulness, perhaps. But there are also concerns with the idea of creativity, which are definitely coming up in this. For instance, there's always this concern about whether or not you can teach creativity to students. Is it arty? And I'll just kind of pick up on this in now as I move through these presentations, but feel free to keep replying. I'm really keen to have a sense about where people are coming from with this. So there's a common misconception that creativity is really just about artistic expression, and that it's about scissors and pens and drawing, and perhaps it's also linked to this kind of like, it's so innovative and it's new that there's a ta-da moment in which we want kind of students to always be kind of at the top end of creativity. But creativity should be understood as a spectrum. And I think for us as historians, creativity is important for us because we are actually creative thinkers, and there's a lot of discussion around this idea of being creative thinkers within the discipline. Joan Scott writes Joan Scott wrote an article about how we are creative thinkers by the way in which we storytell and use our archives and primary sources. I think we're also creative learners as well, because of, as I've just said, this way in which we kind of ask people to construct a narrative or become storytellers, perhaps, of the past. But we are also an interpretive subject, which means that when it comes to creative thinking and how we want our students to engage with creativity, it is about perhaps thinking about innovation or newness or originality of thoughts, and encouraging those practices within the students, within the classroom. And I also think that one of the reasons I like creativity, particularly in a seminar setting, is it because it encourages collaboration and co-production. It's one of those tasks that you can give students in which actually it kind of breaks down certain power dynamics. People can have quite big discussions, they can debate, they can argue, but also they can learn together creatively about how to read through the learning activities that you might be able to construct for them. So for me, I think we need to start imagining the classroom in kind of very different ways. And I think one of the ways in which we could do this is decentering ourselves away from the idea that we're the knowledge makers, and that what we're trying to do is think far more about the seminar room as a space in which we're encouraging creative thinking, which is very neatly aligned with critical thinking. Our students usually come in thinking that they need to know a lot, and that when they're reading articles for the factual information to be able to voice the opinions of historians, which in some ways they do have to do. But at university, we're asking them to do very different things. We're asking them to become interpreters, we're asking them to become questioners. And sometimes that has to be done through a way of thinking about creativity and creative thinking practices. So this is kind of picked up in a really interesting book called The Lifelong Kindergarten by Mitchell Resnick, in which he talks about the idea that when we teach younger students, people in kindergarten, we generally tend to ask them to do things through processes and practices. And that tends to disappear in education as it moves forward, because actually what we want them to do is to learn facts. We want them to be able to hit certain learning aims and certain learning outcomes. For him, he notes this idea that actually what starts to disappear in the higher education classroom, but it's really starting to appear in the secondary school education classroom, is the creative learning spiral, in which this spiral, I've got it on this PowerPoint slide, is about imagining, creating, playing, sharing, reflecting, and imagining. And that's all the things that are happening. And in some ways, what creativity can do, particularly if you, for instance, rather than saying, what does this historian argue, if you kind of ask them to approach their readings by actually asking them to kind of tackle the questions that interest them as a group, what you can actually get them to do is to sort of hypothesize, to argue with each other about their collection, rather than you standing at the front and you're just being stared at by loads of students who are trying to get the right answer that will make you happy as a lecturer. And this then raises this kind of question then about kind of what the creative history classroom can be. And this is picked up a lot by Smith et al. In their piece about how creative classrooms should be a space that focuses on learning through discussion, inquiry, collaboration, and or practice, and much less on learning by acquisition, to emphasize learning for understanding, not content mastery. And in some ways, I think that's really important because our students do come in very nervous about content mastery, and because they're obsessed with having facts and relaying history through factual information. Whereas actually university history is transitioning them continually, particularly because of the dissertation, around this idea of actually thinking far more about understanding, but also creating their own authentic voice. So why do I think creativity is important? So for me, I think creativity is obviously about thinking. It's obviously about the ways of doing and the ways of producing knowledge. But one of the reasons I like creativity is because it fosters a culture of geekness. And it's probably fair to say that I'm quite happy to lean into the idea that I'm quite geeky about history, and I'm very enthusiastic about history. But this is something that Newhouse talks about when she suggests this idea that we have to foster a geek culture in our classrooms, not for exclusion, not for hostile gatekeeping, but rather for enthusiastic sharing. And that's why I like creativity and the idea of emphasizing the notion of creative thinking as a critical attribute, because in some ways it is about sharing and creating discussion and dialogue. I also think we need to think far more than about what we want these spaces to be doing, and our assessments and our classrooms, and when they're away from the classroom itself. We want students to be taking ownership of their interpretation and analysis, and having a bit of fun and playfulness with this can really help us to perhaps do this. I also think it's interesting, and I'll just turn to the history benchmark statement. We are actually seeing the language of creativity being used far more widely. For instance, we're seeing it used in the history benchmark statements, which I find really fascinating. Something Jamie pointed out yesterday is, I don't think creativity would have been in other alliterations of the history benchmark statement. So it's interesting that the one that's just been released on the 30th of March really has creativity as a skill attribute. So we're seeing this idea of creativity actually being latched onto history, a subject where we often, particularly perhaps where we sit with the arts and humanities, often we tend to assume doesn't have that kind of creative edge because of its relationship with science, with objectivity. But here, for instance, they've noticed that it's a generic skill in which we want our students to be able to exhibit imaginative insight and creativity. This is also picked up then with a purpose of a history degree, is to exhibit imaginative insight and creativity. And then we also see this notion of the idea that actually there should be a means of creative problem solving. And one of the ways in which you could be approaching your seminar rooms is to think, actually, how am I going to create a space that enables problem solving to occur for the students, but perhaps in a creative way, either through creative thinking practices, through the ways in which you decide to run your seminars. So I'm going to be honest, I graduated from my history degree, I think not 21 years ago, but I started university 21 years ago. And what's really interesting is the model of learning that I had was very much structured around the idea that you started at the beginning with your seminar reading, you discussed your seminar reading, and then you moved on to perhaps a little bit of primary source analysis that was usually word-based. And that was the model of seminars that basically carried on through. Sometimes we'd just talk about the article for an hour. I think now we can be far more dynamic and innovative about how we approach seminar activities. So what we could be doing is thinking a little bit more about how do we forefront creativity. And the reason why I say this is because we're starting to see it on job specifications. Employers are specifically asking for it. We've even started to see it listed as a humanities skill. So with this whole discussion at the moment about the value of the humanities and the fact that we're being asked in a sort of employment context to be able to talk about creativity, I think we need to be forefronting it for our students, because for them to be able to kind of get jobs or maybe to sort of demonstrate certain skills, this is a really interesting way of actually at the moment articulating and perhaps defining what we mean by creativity. So they obviously say imaginative insight and creativity. We've got creative problem solving, and the idea that it equips graduates to respond creatively and flexibly to current needs. And they've identified environmental needs, but I think we could also talk about the importance of history more broadly within the subject area. There have also been studies done that are suggesting that creative methods in the classroom have more positive outcomes, and things that are really important actually in our, I hate boiling down to metrics, but are important in our surveys and in our NSS around senses of belonging, about support and scaffolding. So there's been sort of identified that creativity allows mental health and well-being. The way in which creativity perhaps puts less pressure on students to be able to participate within a learning environment. It also encourages effective relationships, because of this idea that actually creativity in some ways can be about sort of dynamic seminar participation, working in collaborative groups, by setting tasks in your seminars that might enable you to be able to do this. For myself, I'm really keen on creativity because I think it's an inclusive learning practice. And I think it's really important here what Michael said about this idea that universities ratify inequalities. In particular, this idea that actually, as a neurodivergent lecturer, I'm very aware that actually visual learning and creative learning can support students that are not neurotypical. And so what we can see then is the way in which creativity can support everybody in a learning environment. Because if we take the social definition of disability, it isn't about saying that able people now need to be penalized by giving disabled rights. What we actually see then is everyone gets supported and everyone gets to learn together and effectively. So my creative assessment is enjoyed across the board by everybody, because it's usually done when everyone is writing their dissertations, which is obviously a large taxing piece of writing. And then everyone will say, I just really enjoyed the fact that I was able to use a different part of my brain, that I was able to kind of, actually do something more artistic, or, do some sewing or do all those kind of mindful crafts. I think history can sometimes suffer with the conservatism of assuming that we should be repeating past activities in our learning environments. And so just to give you an example, John Ruskin was very much a favour, he's a Victorian social commentator, was very much in favour of the idea that you should be giving students short essays, because his argument is that's what you did in the civil service. And if you're training Oxbridge men to become civil servants, they should have it practiced to be able to write like that. But we've co-opted that idea of writing and assumed that's tradition and that's the authentic way of being as an academic. And actually, I think sometimes we might want to decenter and rethink about the ways in which we're sort of arguing that the classroom should be, because we assume that tradition, and that's how it's always been done, is the best way. But it isn't, because we now have varying and complex student populations. And we want to be an inclusive discipline. The RHS has done some fabulous work on thinking about the discipline and how we move forward with that. I also think, and one of the reasons I think it's really important to actually challenge people through actually creativity is more to do with this idea of privilege. So I always think it's important to ask yourself, when you're designing something, who are you prepared to exclude through this activity? And to just sort of flip that, what it really means is, why does safety always have to be given to the student that is always going to achieve, or who has already won in the system of higher education? And so there's this really great interview with Rebecca Rebecca Scott. She's a philosopher. And what she's done is she's used Dungeons and Dragons to try and get philosophy students to understand philosophical concepts. Now, I can't go into it because I don't know anything about philosophy, and I don't know anything about Dungeons and Dragons. But I thought it was really cool what she was talking about, this idea of playfulness. And this idea that actually learning through kind of problem solving and reflecting enabled everyone to sort of feel a part of the group. Like there was no kind of judgment in the same way that there might be judgment when you're asking students to say what they think about their reading, for instance. And what she sort of like says at the end of her talk is that what we always do with privilege is we talk about how people are winning in it, but are privileged people really winning if they're never confronted with problems? And actually being an inclusive teacher might actually mean suggesting that playfulness becomes something where even the privileged get to experience epistemic friction, in which actually they're also pushed into new ways of thinking and new ways of participating in the classroom. And it also kind of perhaps enables them to kind of show maybe vulnerabilities, because that's ultimately what they're going to experience when they leave education. So why are we creating this kind of safety environment? Like there's obviously obstacles in place and discrimination, but why, and they should be removed, but why then shouldn't certain skills like creativity be pushed onto people who are going to be reluctant to use them because they have always been able to win in an educational setting? And so she writes, we often think about privilege as benefiting people who have privilege, but there's also ways in which privilege isolates you and prevents you from being able to know things or learn things or develop certain skills. So to get back to inclusivity, I've been thinking about being a teacher is about managing epimistic friction. So the idea that at certain times, certain students in certain contexts actually need a little more friction, and certain students need a little less friction. So actually maybe in some ways, you know, enabling creative learning, creative practices in your classroom will benefit a group so they have less friction. But for another group, it might actually force them to have more friction, and that more friction might be of benefit ultimately to those students. But I think there's always this kind of concern when we start to think about creativity, and I think a lot of the responses about challenges was this idea of, can you teach it? Well, yes, you can teach creativity, because one of the ways in which we can dismantle it is by not thinking of it just as being about artistic expression, but it could be about mind mapping. It could be about pushing people to read or confront things that they don't want to read or confront. So I think one of the ways in which I really like this idea of creativity is, I think, you know, this picks up on Michael's point about how much is being asked of us as lecturers to do and how much to produce. And this really has to do with this idea that actually maybe creativity is actually really good for us as academics, because it makes the classroom less maybe static, maybe a bit dry, a bit boring. One of the reasons I like creativity is because it means that every year everything is approached slightly differently. You can see and hear the student voice far more authentically than if you're just trying to get them to read articles, to engage with the questions that you've set. So one of the ways of thinking about creative thinking is actually getting them to come up with the questions themselves, and getting them to respond to each other in those ways. So, for instance, one of the things I've decided to do this year is when students are looking at pictures of people sewing, I've decided I'm going to get them to sew at the same time. And I think that's an important embodied learning practice, because they get to then maybe feel something coming from the picture about what it means to be sewing. But there's also something about that kind of idea of just nattering and dismantling the idea that, you know, it feels like you have to be kind of academic and performing in a certain way in a classroom when it comes to participation. So I really loved this quote, and I've only just got this book and I haven't read very much of it, but I thought this quote really stood out. The word creative is there because we feel passionately that teaching is a vibrant, dynamic and unpredictable process that draws on all your faculties. As a teacher, you're committed to enabling your students to learn, but that might mean coming at a subject in a whole new way, trying out a number of approaches, listening to what the learners have to say, or simply pausing and thinking, how can we do this differently? Dunn describes this as a sort of alchemy, a power or a process that changes or transforms something in a mysterious or impressive way. We're not just trying to move minds, but hearts too, not just the students, but our own. And so one of the things I'd really like you to perhaps think about now is, do you have any idea about how you could be creative in the classroom, or how you're going to be creative in the future, either for this year or next year? Or have you had any sort of activity in the past which you could share? And I'll give you a couple of minutes and you can return to the Google document if you would like to. See, Sue Adams already has her class activity in doing patchwork, perhaps with the students. Oh, Josh, I really love that idea of like a playlist of music. Our gamification, that is really interesting. Like maybe asking people to like do gamification and also film proposals or TV kind of approaches could be really cool. Yep, collaborative mind mapping in the class. And actually, my students love watching me mind map, because one of the things they really want is for you to be showing them how they should be learning and grouping and thinking. Yeah, I think role play is great, because one of the great things about role play is it makes debating less challenging, and people can get really really inspired by this. Sam, I think you're 100% right. I think the idea of cutting up essays and actually making people physically dismantle their writing, or maybe even seeing students, that's such a lovely idea. Because I think a lot of the time, you know, when we think about our practices, we encourage the digital, and sometimes we might want to think a little bit more about the tactile and the ways of kind of seeing these processes happening. Yeah, Amy, I think you're 100% right. It is about kind of thinking about collaborating with other student groups. And one of the things I want to kind of say now is just a preface is me doing these creative exercises was one of the ways in which I started to feel comfortable working with public audiences and working with heritage groups, because ultimately we are also being asked to enter other learning environments. And so if we want to kind of dismantle and sort of like maybe kind of be more authentic to ourselves, that might be a really nice way of kind of getting the confidence to do it, to do that type of work. And Jamie, you're 100% right, it is about Lego as well. So as I've said, I'm really interested in creativity as a method, and I generally tend to do this in various ways. I mind map to students on the board. when they're making points and they're talking. This validates the thinking that they have, but as I've already said, it means, for instance, that they can actually see how to, one, note take, which they become very concerned about, whether or not they're taking the right notes, whether or not they're getting the right information, but also how did you group it together. So I mind map for them on the board. In the past, I've done digital exercises with Google Jamboard, particularly in the pandemic classroom. You might want to think about whether or not you set up an exercise where they can kind of put a primary source up or become kind of creative in creating a sort of something before class. But I have found that that kind of approach to learning has disappeared now that we've returned back to the physical classroom. Instead, I really like thinking about creating variety in seminars, and one of the best practices for creativity, for creative thinking, has for me been the silent seminar, which is done in a group, and it's called silent, but it's not really silent actually. It's when you kind of tear up the primary source that you're asking students to look at, and you move the primary source around different groups. And so group 1 will read one extract, group 2 will read another extract, and group 3 will read another extract, and you're asking them to interpret, but you're kind of showing them at the same time the layering of interpretation. So you might need to start off generically, but then you move and you filter down to some very kind of specific points or observations to kind of hone in that idea that you need to do repeat reading, that you need to do close reading of your source material. So Jamie already said this, but I'm running a series of workshops over September and December around the idea of creativity and how historians could use it and how we can define it. And you're more than welcome to come along. The QR code on the screen takes you to the list and the programme about this. And one of the things I'm going to do at the end in January in a workshop is ask participants to create a page of a zine, to create a creative history classroom manifesto, so that we can kind of understand why creativity is important, because we are at this stepping stone. Like, what you might have sensed this when we were looking at the history and benchmark is actually historians are yet to define or really articulate what they mean by these very abstract skill concepts. And so what I want to do is try and lead those discussions around how we understand creativity itself. So I've also just given you some resources and pedagogy around this, just to kind of help you think about it. The two podcasts are really great introductions to the idea of playfulness and creativity more generally. But really, to be honest with you, I think it's really what I want to kind of close now is just to say, just be playful in how you approach your classroom design, in how you want to think about participating with students in their learning journey. It doesn't always be dull, dry, fact-driven. And I'm sure in some ways that isn't what you've experienced. But I think we do need to be shaking up the idea of what history as a discipline, as a learning experience, and really looks like and feels like for our students. So I did overrun, didn't I?
No.
Oh, no, okay, cool.
No, absolutely not. We've got plenty of kind of wiggle room. Thank you so much, Lucie. That was wonderful, and I've jotted down loads of references and things to follow up. So I just thought if anybody has any questions, please add them to the chat, or comments, please add them to the chat. I think one of the things that I appreciate about this movement that you're harnessing or leading is the like, it invites us to think about teaching and learning as something that is fun, and doesn't have to be, obviously on some level it is a serious affair. Students are paying a lot of money, we're treating them professionally and all those sorts of things, but that it doesn't have to be a kind of dull experience. It can be something that is like I said, fun. And also I think that I really love the way that in which it can draw on people's interests outside of perhaps their interests that are outside of their academic studies, and draw on those things and integrate their life with their studies, rather than seeing them as two separate things. That I think is really inspirational in a way.
Yeah, and I think it's also it's quite interesting, because it's like a lot of my students will kind of say, oh, I remember doing this in class. So when I got I recently started the practice of getting students to use trump cards when they want to talk about class in the Victorian city. And I think that's just a really interesting way of them getting to understand the complexities of class, rather than the kind of binaries, because they get to see other kind of identity markers on a trump card.
That's great. And I think as well, it invites us to think about teaching and learning as a process, rather than as something that kind of ends, really. That it's something that's ongoing, really, and that we can sort of grapple with like together with the students, rather than it being something that is much more us dragging them along or pushing them along.
And I think I should sort of like end by saying, you don't have to make every session creative. Like, there is still value in doing things traditionally, but this might be a case for you kind of to be playful yourself. And I know that when you're an ECR and when you're starting off, the problem is that you don't necessarily find the work energizing, because it can sometimes feel like you're doing, which is why I think sometimes thinking about, well, what is it that you enjoy and you have a kind of skill or interest in, that you could think would be a kind of interesting way of teaching the students, or sort of participating in the learning process with the students in a different way. That's why I really like things like role play, because in some ways you don't have to design those sessions, you just have to set up the task and accept that, there might be risk that it doesn't quite work. But if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter, because the students are still learning and you can still interject and participate. I think the risk all the time with being in a learning environment when you're the lecturer is you have to show off that you know everything. And you do kind of and it's really hard when you're junior, and sometimes I think it's harder maybe for female members of staff who are younger, but you do just kind of have to kind of accept that you can't know everything, because unfortunately you just don't have the time. And I think that really resonates with what Michael was saying, is look around and see what other people are doing in their seminars that you can kind of borrow and get energized from setting up those tasks, rather than feeling that you have to have a discussion about the reading.
Absolutely. And that there are plenty of other opportunities in any history degree to do the reading and to engage in that, and in that traditional approach, which I think we both teach in that way as well, or mix up the two at various times. Fantastic.